Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. As we all know, we're experiencing a period of extreme geopolitical turmoil, which is creating a variety of challenges for the transatlantic community. What we don't necessarily know is how public opinion is responding to these challenges. Thankfully, the annual Transatlantic Trends Survey can help us understand some of the trends in 14 countries that participate in or make up part of the transatlantic community. And so I'm delighted to welcome Bruce Stokes to share the survey's findings. He's a visiting senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and a senior editor of the 2022 Transatlantic Trends Survey. He also co-authored the recent GMF study titled Designing Ukraine's Recovery in the Spirit of the Marshall Plan. Bruce, I'd like to welcome you back to the ACG. It is great to see you. My only regret is that we're not seeing each other in person because it is always wonderful to see you and to talk with you.
Steve, thank you. And it's great to be with you. And as you say, I have fond memories of meetings we've had in the past. So I look forward to the conversation. You know, what I learned from all of this is from the questions. What are people interested in? What do they object to? All that kind of thing. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Well, in a somewhat different format from what we've been doing in our webinars, which have tended to be very conversational, we thought that today we would let Bruce present some of the key findings of the Transatlantic Trends Survey. And then maybe I'll ask a question or two, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, from our viewers, and have a chance to discuss it. So with that, Bruce, let me hand the floor over to you, and you can share your screen and take over.
So let me see if I can get this screen to share here. It's what I would like to lead off with is to explain that this is a survey of 14 countries, including Germany. It was done from late May to early July. So the war in Ukraine had already begun, but any event that took place after early July, we shouldn't assume that the public opinion reflects whatever happened since then. It involved online survey of 1,500 people in each country, with some phone calls in Turkey to reach audiences that we couldn't reach online. And the demographics are roughly reflect the demographics of each country. So we do have some demographic analysis we can do. One of the first questions we asked people was who they thought had the greatest influence in global affairs. And about 2/3 of the respondents in the 14 countries said it was the United States. And they also saw by roughly the same margin that the US was the most reliable country in the world. You can note that the European Union was in second place, but way behind. China not far behind bad, and Russia really not at all. What's interesting, it seems to me, from this, if you look at the country results on this question, is that 2/3 of the Poles and the Portuguese and the Lithuanians see the US as the most influential actor. You will see this again and again in the survey results, that it's the peripheries of Europe. It's the Portuguese and sometimes the Spanish, plus the Poles, the Lithuanians, who are seem to share the same views on a number of issues. If you had told me that it was only the Eastern Europeans or maybe only the Southern Europeans who thought something, I might have expected that. But what's interesting is it's almost countries on the periphery see things slightly differently than people more to the center of Europe. The other thing to draw from this is in almost every case, in almost every question we ask, the Italians had the most glum, the most negative view in this case, but also in other cases as well. And bear in mind, this took place before the Italian election. And I think it was a foretaste of the Italian election because it basically was saying the Italians are in a very negative space, in that negative place. And I've been doing public opinion survey work for over a decade, and you often find this, that in a particular country, people are just negative. And if you ask them, how do you feel about the sun coming up in the morning, they would be negative. And I think what you're then picking up is not necessarily a response to that particular question, but just a generally sour mood of the public. Notice that Germany is somewhere in the middle here in terms of its views of the United States. Probably one of the two most significant findings in this survey is we ask people not only who has the most influence today, but who do you think will have the most influence in 5 years? And what is, I think, very disturbing from an American point of view is that there was a 27 percentage point decline in people's belief that the US would have the most influence 5 years from now. A slight increase in the perception of China, very slight decrease, really no decrease at all, margin of error stuff for the European Union. But clearly people have worries about the future influence of the United States. And this is it, that sense of the future influence of the United States is down particularly in Italy, France, the Netherlands, not down as much in Germany, but then German views were not as strong as some other countries when we're talking about today. However, there is a strong approval of President Biden's handling of international affairs. A majority in the survey support that. And not surprisingly, his job approval in handling international affairs is the strongest in the frontline states in the Ukraine conflict. And probably not as a surprise for those Americans on the call, Americans are really divided about Biden's leadership in foreign affairs. And I can tell you it's highly partisan. The Democrats are very supportive and Republicans are very opposed. The Germans are fairly supportive. 64% approve of his handling of international affairs, which is basically what the average is. There's also increased support for US involvement in the defense and security of Europe. And when I first saw these results, I thought, okay, we're helping on Ukraine, it makes sense. But what's interesting is that both in France and Germany, the first sign of an increase in support for US involvement in defense and security came in 2021 in the survey, not in 2022. So it came before the Ukraine war, which I think we can only interpret as we are happy Joe Biden is the president. We're glad that Donald Trump is no longer the president because we thought we couldn't rely on the United States to be involved in the defense and security of Europe. Now we think we can rely on the US, and so we're supportive of that engagement. As you can see, there's been an increase in Germany from basically 24% who want the US to be greatly involved to 45% who want the US to be greatly involved. That's a huge increase, almost a doubling in the intensity of support for this. So that it seems to me is an interesting development. And notice France is near the bottom now. The French aren't so sure they want the US to be increasingly involved in the US, but still a majority, as a previous slide showed, and it has increased over time. We asked people, who do you think is the most influential country in Europe? And basically 75% of the respondents said Germany. 55 said the UK, which is kind of interesting since the UK is not part of the European Union anymore. But nevertheless, that's what people told us. This is a little hard to read, but what I wanted to show to you, because the dark blue is where you had the strongest belief that a particular country was most influential. As you can see, Germany's the first country we list at the top. If you read down, you can see it's dark blue all the way until you get to the United States. Only 44% of Americans say Germany is the most influential country in Europe. A majority of Americans, 54%, say the UK is the most influential country in Europe. That would suggest that the special relationship still exists. On the other hand, it may also suggest that many Americans don't realize that the UK has left Europe. We asked people about the reliability of partners. This is the results we got for the reliability of Germany. As you can see, the Portuguese are very supportive of German reliability, very strongly believe that Germany is a reliable partner, as do the French, by the way, and the Dutch and the Romanians. And a majority of Americans see Germany as a reliable partner, but it's only 6 in 10 as opposed to 8 in 10 in Portugal or France. So it is interesting. And of course, the Poles are even slightly, it's still a majority of Poles, but it's really only barely half who see Germany as reliable. We asked a question about the EU's influence in global affairs. 2/3 of the respondents say it's a positive influence, very strong support for the EU, and you'll see this in another question as well. The Portuguese are the most likely, as well as the Lithuanians and the Romanians, the Poles, to see the EU as influential in global affairs. Again, it's a reemergence of this. The margins of Europe are much more supportive of the EU, or more likely to say that the EU has great influence in global affairs. 63% of Germans say this. It's just lower than, say, the Portuguese or the Lithuanians. Let's see, I may have there. We ask also about NATO. And I think not surprisingly, the perception that NATO is important has grown dramatically by 11 percentage points between 2021 and 2022. This, I think, is definitely a reflection of the Ukrainian conflict. And that perception is particularly strong. It's gone up from 23% of Germans who said that NATO is very important. In other words, the intensity was 23%. It's gone up to 53%. Again, more than a doubling of the intensity of support for NATO in Germany. We wanted to ask questions about the Ukraine war. And bear in mind, we wrote some of these in midsummer, early spring. So it is, we wrote them in early spring and they were applied in the summer. I think some of these don't apply anymore, but what is interesting is that more than 2/3 of the respondents supported toughening economic sanctions on Russia, and 6 in 10 support inviting Ukraine to join NATO, which is, as you know, not yet on offer. The Ukrainians want that, but it's not on offer. There is a majority support we found for offering Ukraine membership in the EU. There is not a support for sending NATO troops to Ukraine. You see it particularly low in Germany. Only 28% of respondents in Germany said we should send NATO troops to Ukraine, which of course is not on offer at this point. I'd say the second most interesting result of the survey is 81%, 8 in 10 of the respondents said, of the European respondents, said that the EU is important to their national security. Which I think, I don't know about our listeners, but when I think of national security, I think of military affairs. Clearly, the public sees national security much more broadly. It may be controlling the borders, it may be economic growth, it may be the efforts of the EU to sanction Russia. But clearly the public has a much broader view of national security, and they think that the EU is important to that national security. So I think this is a very important finding, actually, in terms of the support for the EU. I can tell you, when I briefed people in Brussels, they were very pleased with this result, to say the least. And what's interesting is that 75% of Germans said that the EU was very important or somewhat important to their national security. Again, note that it was the Portuguese, the Lithuanians, the Romanians, and the Poles who were most likely to say this, or most supportive of the EU's role in national security. Again, I think you might be able to explain away the Lithuanian, Romanian, or Polish beliefs, given the role that the EU is playing in the Ukraine conflict. Why the Portuguese are so supportive of the EU as a national security provider, I have no idea. Interestingly enough, we asked people about who say that the EU is important, and we asked them, who do you want to help manage relations with China and Russia? Do you want to do it through the EU? Do you want to do it through the US? Do you want to do it alone? And what's interesting is that even though there's a dialogue between the US and the EU on managing relations both with China and with Russia, the publics really don't support that, or at least they may not know about it, but they certainly are not supportive of it. As many of you know, it is the way in which both the EU and the US frame their relationship with China. They use the same diplomatic language, which is that China is a partner, a competitor, and a rival. So we asked the public what they thought about that. And frankly, that communication doesn't work with the public. 29% said they had no idea how to choose their relationship with China. And frankly, what the distinction is between competitor and rival in terms of the public's view, I'd be hard pressed to explain that. And clearly, if you assume that competitor and rival are very closely aligned, you do have almost half of the respondents see China in that negative light, where only 25% see it as a partner. It is interesting, if you look at this chart, the Germans are the most likely to say they see China as a competitor, and the Americans are the most likely to say that they, well, it's tied between competitor and rival. It's interesting that there is, in Lithuania, of all places, only 21% see China as a rival. As many of you will know, there's this very difficult relationship between Beijing and Lithuania, with lots of sanctions being imposed on each side. And the public, 36% of the public in Lithuania doesn't know how to classify their relationship with China. I would have expected a much more negative approach by the Lithuanians to China. Europeans are very supportive of being tough on China about human rights. A majority of Americans agree, but it's only 53%, as opposed to more than 6 in 10, 2/3 in France, 6 in 10 in Canada, 6 in 10 in the Netherlands. So what other surveys have shown in the past, we see again in this survey, that as Europeans think about China, the thing they object to the most is China's human rights behavior. We did ask people whether they'd be willing to be tougher on China, regardless of the negative impact, economic impact it may have. A majority of respondents said we would be willing to be tougher on China, even if it costs us something. The Spanish and the Swedes are the most willing, and the Romanians are the least willing to pay a price for being tougher on China. 56% of Americans are willing to be tougher, pay a price. It's roughly comparable to the 54% in Germany. But they're both in the middle of this survey in terms of attitudes. Because of the growing tensions around Taiwan and China's threats to Taiwan, we ask people in the survey, would you be willing to send arms to Taiwan? You would be willing to send troops to Taiwan. Bear in mind, this is before this survey took place before the Pelosi visit, and before the President Biden has made some very tough statements about what we would do in terms of defending Taiwan. But clearly, the publics do not support a military engagement for the defense of Taiwan. Only 4% of our survey support sending arms to Taiwan. I can tell you it's 8% in the United States, but still these numbers are very small. And the Americans are already sending arms to Taiwan, so there's no support for even doing that. And in terms of sending troops to Taiwan, only 2% of our survey respondents were willing to do that. Only 7% of Americans. And frankly, given my experience with public opinion polling, you can get 2% of people to say almost anything. So it's not at all clear there's any support for military engagement. On the other hand, what people were willing to do is support economic sanctions or diplomatic engagement if the Chinese would invade Taiwan. Finally, we asked people about the state of their democracy. Overall, about half of them said it was good, but this is down 5 percentage points from 2021. 45% said it was bad. Notice you can see that in the United States, 53% said it was bad. Poland, 55%. Italy, again, right before the election, 64%. So I guess the outcome of the election was to be seen in this data. It's interesting, the Swedes, the Portuguese, and the Canadians are the most satisfied with their democracy. As you can see, the German satisfaction has actually gone down from 2021. And only a bit, but still it's down by about about 6 points. So there has been a decline. There's been a dramatic decline in the UK in satisfaction with their democracy, also a dramatic decline in the Netherlands and in the United States. So that's an overview of the Transatlantic Trends Survey. I'm looking forward to our conversation and your questions.
Bruce, thank you for that amazing snapshot. I found that really, really interesting to hear, and I was happy that you highlighted a couple of particularly interesting data sets. But I wanted to start by maybe asking, given that you've spent over a decade doing this kind of polling, was there anything that surprised you about the results this time around?
I would say that the decline in perception of the U.S. Being the world's leading actor in 5 years was not surprising, given that I would say almost every conversation I have with Europeans, they worry about the future of American democracy. They worry about our political system. What is it going to produce next? They were traumatized by Trump. And so while I think it's bad news for the United States that people expect our influence to decline, it's probably not surprising. The belief that the EU provides national security, I think I would not have anticipated it. I know I didn't anticipate it. I think it's the strength in support of the Germans of the United States is reassuring. And I can tell you the Pew Research Center recently released their study of US-German public opinion and how we see each other. and it was very positive, similarly to what we found, which again is reassuring. It's always good when you do public opinion surveys to see other surveys and how they compare. And do you come up with roughly the same results? You're not going to come up with perfectly similar results, but if they're both going in the same direction, then you say, okay, we did it right and we're accurate. And so I think that was good for the U.S.-German relationship, that we both found roughly the same thing. Other results that are typical, and on many of these questions, when you look at the data inside Germany, you continue to have, this won't come as a surprise to Germans, but you continue to have 30 years after the reunification of Germany, the attitudes in the former Eastern Germany remain statistically significantly different from the rest of Germany. And I guess in 1989 or whatever, if you had said to me, well, how long is it going to take for these attitudes to kind of become similar? I would have said, oh, less than a generation. Well, it's now been a generation, right? And they haven't. The differences really haven't narrowed, which is a real challenge for Germany, and a challenge for people who care about Germany.
Yeah, and maybe we can dig into that a little bit more. Obviously, the issue around these demographics is really important, and in some of the other work that we're doing, we're also seeing a bit of a split between the East and the West. I mean, the other thing that I thought was really interesting that you highlighted at the outset was both sort of the different viewpoints from more peripheral European countries, if you will, versus the major European countries, and also sort of how glum Italy was throughout many of the questions that were asked, and I found that really interesting. But I also wanted to unpack a little bit more this question, not only of influence, but also of reliability, because I think that these are two, very different questions to be asked and things to approach. Particularly, I want to ask you if there's any rationale for why the U.S. might lose influence over the next 5 years. The increase of China was nominal. I think it was only 12% or something like that.
14% was not. I mean, it was not. It was an increase, but it was not.
But the sort of loss of confidence in American influence was more than double that at, I guess, 27%. Yeah. Any sense of why there's that perception right now?
Well, I mean, on one hand, we have to remind ourselves that a good question, and I think this was a good question, evokes an emotional response, not a rational response. These are average people. They don't lie awake nights kind of thinking, somebody asked me a question about who's going to be reliable in 5 years. What am I going to say? And my experience has been in polling that if you do follow up with respondents, they really don't know why they've felt that way, but they are going to go vote based on emotion, not on reason. We know that from vast experience. They operate in the marketplace. They buy a red car rather than a blue car, even though it's the same car under the hood, because they like red, which is an emotional response, not a rational response. And so it's good to know what their emotions are. And again, my sense is it's because of the trauma of the Trump years that people have, they realize there'll be another US election. They aren't sure whether that will produce. They also will have some knowledge of kind of the defects of the American democracy. I mean, there's so much money spent and all these fights over voting restrictions and things like that. But I think it's more fundamental than that. It's as one green member of the Bundestag said to me at one point, I like Americans. I like the United States. I don't trust your political system.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we don't know, but I think that even when we were disagreeing about issues in foreign policy, for example, over the Vietnam War or over the stationing of short-range missiles in Germany, or over the Iraq War, or that even though we disagreed, I don't think there was that sense that there's something broken about American democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, let's assume that people are right that it's broken. It's not a question of, oh, the U.S. was a shining city on the hill and now it's not. And we know from other data, Pew has done a survey where they ask people, do you think the United States is still a democratic model for your country? And a majority of Europeans say no.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just that. It's that it, in its brokenness, it will produce an outcome which will affect our interests in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the threat to leave NATO, the coziness with Putin, the denial of climate change. I mean, things that Europeans care about. And I think that's the difference from the past. I mean, Europeans thought we were warmongers and cowboys in Vietnam. Okay, fine,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it didn't directly affect European interests going forward. Now I think they see the outcome of the American elections affecting their security, affecting the choices they have to make going forward. I mean, this has, in a different way, made the French argument for years that we have to have strategic autonomy. It raises it in a different context, right? This is not a Gaullist kind of thing, and this is just the French being the French. It is we really probably do have to do some things because we can't trust the Americans anymore.
I mean, do you have a sense, given that this survey was conducted between May and July, that people were thinking ahead about the midterms and about 2024? Part of the reason why I'm asking that is one of our viewers is curious whether respondents are concerned about changes in U.S. leadership on the world stage, particularly if the Republican Party wins this November, if there's a change in government in 2024. Is that something that was on people's minds?
I mean, I think, again, I can only draw my impressions from discussions I've had with Europeans, and I ran the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Task Force for 2 years, and so I interviewed 100 European thought leaders, and I would say in 95 of those interviews, they're concerned about the future of American democracy and the American political system came up. They raised it, but I would be surprised if many of our average respondents, these are just average people, understand the short-term implications of a change in control of the Congress, which is really what it's at stake in November, right? Because I know when in discussing it with audiences have raised it, there's no kind of indication from people, oh yeah, we've thought about that, we're worried about that. It's really about 2024. What they're really worried about is, will Trump come back, or will there be somebody like Trump who comes back? And I think there probably is also an understanding, even if it's just kind of they couldn't put their finger on it, of the growing instability in Washington and the political alignment in Washington. I mean, I don't think even Americans appreciate that in the 12 elections we had between 1952 and 1974, where either the House, the Senate, or the White House changed hands. So any of those, one or more of those could change hands. One or more in those 12 elections changed hands 3 times. And assuming the Republicans win the House of Representatives in November, which I think everybody believes is going to happen, in the last 12 elections, there would have been change of control 10 times.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a sign of instability. As I like to say to people, that's Italian level instability.
Yep.
I mean, that's not, because it's not just that you get a change in power now of between kind of Tweedledum and Tweedledee Democrats and Republicans, both of whom are somewhat moderate. You get real changes of power. I mean, real changes of perspective. And for a foreigner, I think that the implications are, will the U.S. remain engaged in Ukraine once the Republicans regain control of the House? McCarthy, who is likely to be the Speaker of the House for the Republicans, has said that he did not think that they would be able to maintain the same kind of support for Ukraine that the U.S. has been providing to date, because this money has to be approved by Congress. Staffers I've talked to on the Republican side in Capitol Hill are maybe a little more optimistic, but not. This was before their next leader said this.
Right.
And you do have loud voices on the extreme right in the Republican Party, members of the House of Representatives, who are basically already saying, why are we doing this? We shouldn't, it's not our job. And those voices will grow. Donald Trump will probably run for re-election or for election. He has been expressing those views, so that it would amplify that. The House of Representatives under Republican control will begin multiple investigations of the Biden administration. And one of those will be of Hunter Biden, the president's son, and his involvement in Ukraine. And, it's all about corruption.
Right.
And so that'll inject that issue, which is a legitimate issue. Not maybe Hunter Biden, but certainly corruption in Ukraine's a legitimate issue. But it'll interject that into the conversation and give people a rationale for maybe pulling back. And so I think that while there will be some consequences for cooperation on shared issues like Ukraine after this election, the real fear people have is what could happen after 2024.
Well, and I think that's one of the reasons why the reliability question is so important. And if I remember the number correctly, it looked like there was a drop in sort of U.S. confidence in Germany from 2021 to 2022 down to 59%. So a drop in 5 percentage points or 9 percentage points there. And if at a time when certainly Americans are looking to Europe to take on more responsibility in addressing some of the problems in Europe's backyard, these questions around reliability become incredibly important.
I mean, assuming you're right, you're right about the numbers falling for Germany. And I don't know why, right? I mean, the part of me that says it can't be that they understand that the Germans aren't sending the Leopard tanks to Ukraine or whatever. On the other hand, how else do we explain it?
Right.
And so it may be a sign that this Zeitenwende, this idea that Germany has dramatically changed its view about what it would do militarily, and it has been sending military supplies to Ukraine, maybe not what we want, maybe not enough, but still something they never did before, that's not fully appreciated by Americans. Or is it a reflection that whatever Germany might do, from the perspective of many Americans, it's not enough?
Yeah.
And I think that's at least part of it, because we know from other surveys that Americans believe, I would say incorrectly, but this is what they tell us in multiple surveys, we do everything and nobody does anything. Woe is us. We bear the burdens of the world and nobody else is of help. And while that's factually incorrect, if you believe that, then any evidence that, say, Germany is not doing more or as much as we'd like them to do, then they're not reliable, right? And so I think there's a connection there, which is probably unconscious in some people's minds, right?
Yeah.
But it's there.
But Bruce, I think, I mean, you're in Washington and obviously much closer than I am to the inside view as well. One of the things that I think is fascinating about this study and that data point in specific is it's normal Americans who are weighing in on that. The sense I have from the Washington crowd is that there is recognition and appreciation, particularly at the State Department, of everything that Germany is doing. There's recognition that it will take time to meet the aspirations of the Zeitenwende. And part of it comes down to sort of the domestic and international communication by Chancellor Scholz and others of what Germany's actually doing. I mean, it's been commented upon that Boris Johnson was able to get great credit for not really doing very much, and that Scholz, who was doing more, was sort of conspicuous through his absence in that. So it's a question of kind of bringing it into alignment and informing Americans about what is actually being done, even if more is expected of Germany and needs to be done by Germany.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a general impression when you talk to staffers, when you talk to government officials, as you say, that people in the State Department I talk to are fully aware that, for example, countries in Europe are bearing fairly large costs for refugee resettlement. That almost never comes up when I talk to average people, and they don't understand that. And but there seems to be a general awareness, and this doesn't really just apply just to Germany, but Europe is not living up to what we think it should do. And frankly, I mean, the EU just announced, I think, a €5 billion to Ukraine, but it's still, they still haven't delivered all the money that they promised to deliver. And there's certainly a perception that it's still not enough. And we know it's not going to be enough. It's going to be a need for more. And I think the Germans are in the crosshairs because they lead the frugals, the Scandinavians and others, in saying no mutualization of debt. We've done this now 3 times, but we're not doing it again. And how we continue to pay for the war in Ukraine, but actually the bigger cost is going to be how do we pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine, which the World Bank says could be $300 billion, and that was already a month ago, so it's probably more. And the largest share of that money is going to have to come from public money is going to have to come from Europe. And how Europe pays for that, I think, is going to become an increasingly fractious issue. And Germany is going to be in the crosshairs because it's the FDP basically saying no mas. And I think that although I was talking to a very senior Danish economics official the other day, and he said, we're even more frugal than the Germans. So I don't,
Of
course, I pointed out to him that the people who are the frugals are also now some of the strongest hawks in terms of the war. It's like you can't have it both ways, right?
Right. This is true. This is true. I'd like to come back to the state of democracy before bringing in a couple of viewer questions about the EU. One of the points that you made was this sort of loss in confidence or waning confidence in democratic institutions and practices, going from 55% in 2021 to 50% this year, with sort of significant drops in the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden. And part of the purpose of the Transatlantic Trend Study, and part of what you are trying to do with this study, is make policymakers aware of what these trends are. And I'd be curious to know how some of the people that you've shared the results with have responded to some statistics on this sort of waning confidence in democracy, and whether they've already started to articulate or think about ideas for how to counter that, how to work against that, how to instill more confidence?
Well, I think, the president, so President Biden, has obviously made this a theme of his, right? That we're democracies combating autocracy, and we need to work together. I have a piece in Foreign Affairs that came up when it was posted on Monday about this very issue, and how, but it was focused on how this is hurting America's soft power. The perception of the weakness of our democracy is an issue that foreign policy elites have to be more worried about, because it has foreign policy consequences, which is what you're suggesting. And I must admit, it's always been a quandary for me. We can have conferences about, oh, we have to strengthen democracy, and we can do defensive things. Make sure that the Russians or the Chinese aren't engaging in kind of disinformation, or even, God forbid, meddling in the counting of our votes or whatever. But that's all defensive. It doesn't necessarily improve the perception of the average American or German or European about the strength of their democracy. And I think we have to presume that's because people don't see it as delivering for them. And that's probably sui generis to each country at some level. Part of it's structural. Certainly, I'm a severe critic of all the voter suppression that goes on in the US, and these threats to how votes get counted, et cetera. But the concern about democracy actually predates a lot of that, because it's a question of, are our governments providing the kinds of solutions to problems that the average citizen faces. And I think that's harder for people to take to heart, right? Because it means, well, we have to question whether I'm doing a good job as a congressman or a senator or whatever. And that's, people, they don't want to hear that, basically.
Right. Switching gears a little bit, one of our viewers wrote that Europeans have long had a broader view of national security than Americans have, sort of a wider definition. And so their confidence in the EU was not surprising. What she did find surprising was the relatively high percentage of Europeans who saw the US as being reliable. And that sort of leads into a question that someone else posed, which is that we've seen pretty strong support for EU institutions on the periphery of Europe. And this viewer writes, do you think that this might help the newly or recently proposed European political community take a stronger hold on the edges of the continent? How do you think that an organization like this could evolve over the coming years if this trend continues?
Well, it's interesting, because this is an adaptation of an old idea that's been around forever. On one hand, I'm a little skeptical because it didn't catch on before, so why now? On the other hand, I can think of some reasons why it might catch on. I mean, it was interesting in that in our survey, 54% of the Brits said the EU was important to their national security. It's like, excuse me, you just left the EU. So I think there may be something there. I think it depends what it eventually ends up looking like. If it's just a talking shop, I mean, I think it has to actually produce some things. And yet it may be a way to deal with core Europe's relations with the periphery that are currently kind of difficult to see where we go. I mean, Britain is not going to come back into the EU anytime soon. I was an opponent of Brexit, so I hope they do someday, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. We have the Turkish problem. It's been around forever. And I personally don't see the EU ever admitting Turkey But on the other hand, geography matters. So you got to, what's the relationship here?
And indeed, those Turkey numbers were very interesting when thinking about welcoming Ukraine into NATO or the European Union.
Yeah. And look, I mean, we have the Balkans, right? And when are some of these countries going to get into? But we have the experience of Bulgaria,
right,
and Hungary, and for different reasons, questions about whether this was a good idea, right? And it's complicated matters inside the EU. And while the Ukrainians, I know, having talked to them, they want to be on a fast track to EU membership. There's no fast track to EU membership. This is going to take a long time. And could there be some halfway way of dealing with Ukraine, which then, of course, other countries would want, and will core Europe really want to do that? But I mean, the real challenge, I think, with Ukraine is people seem to not focus on the fact that per capita income in Ukraine before the war was a third of that in Poland and half of that in Bulgaria.
Right.
Ukraine's a pretty poor country.
Right.
We kind of celebrate all the technology people and all this, but it's a very poor country, and you can't have a successful accession to the EU unless you can lift up the per capita income significantly. It doesn't have to be at German levels, but it can't continue to be a third of Polish levels, because if you bring them in and they're that poor, people will just leave, right?
Right.
And because there's freedom of movement, and also you got to assume at some point you'll get an Orban in Ukraine,
right,
inside the tent, and saying, this isn't working for my people, and I'm going to be an obstructionist. And that's the last thing the EU needs. And frankly, that's the last thing the US needs.
Yeah.
Because we need a strong and stable Europe as a partner.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do think, particularly since we're talking about this now, that we should have you back again to talk about Ukraine's recovery, because of the fact that you authored the GMF study recently that really focused on that. Because the sense that I have is a lot of people are thinking more about sort of the immediate, how do we end this conflict, and not the mid to long term of what does Ukraine's recovery look like. And of course, it's not too early right now to be thinking about that. But that's a completely different topic. But maybe as we start to wrap things up, I'm happy that you brought up the UK just now in your response, because I did think it was interesting that such a high percentage feel that the UK is an influential European country. And of course, again, the survey was conducted over the summer. Things might look a little bit different now, given the change in leadership and the challenges that the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, is having at the moment. You started to talk a little bit about who knows what direction the UK will go in, but do you see the UK as being a strong actor moving forward?
What has struck me is like I say, I did this about 150 interviews, more than 175 interviews with transatlantic thought leaders for this Transatlantic task force, and no one had any idea of what we do with the UK, right? I mean, they've left the EU, and I would press people and say, okay, we got to figure out how to integrate them into the transatlantic space economically. We have NATO, okay, fine, but there are all sorts of other issues, and I think people are at a loss to figure out how we do that. And the real worries are more short term. I mean, what does the British government do about Northern Ireland? And, what kind of problems did that create as a result? I mean, I think the fact that the UK has been a strong military partner around Ukraine I know from talking to US officials that they really respect that and are very pleased with that. But as you say, the political chaos in the UK and the economic troubles they're going to have for probably years to come are going to probably both preoccupy them and make them a much less attractive partner because, as an Italian economist pointed out to me yesterday, in recent years, they've had as many prime ministers as Italy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, many of them are the same party. It's slightly
Right.
different than Italy, but the point being, that's if you start making the comparison to instability in Italy with UK, then how do you deal with them?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it will be, yet another interesting narrative to watch. I share your hope too, that one day the UK comes back into the EU, but I do not think that that's something that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah.
And it will actually continue to be a disruptor, and you have to wonder whether Brussels will want the UK back when the time comes, right?
I mean, that's it. I mean, look, it's not just like they're going to be welcomed like, the prodigal son and everything. Yeah. There will be demands made on the UK, and like the EU will have moved on. So there'll be, I mean, they're not going to be rejoining the same EU. It's going to have who knows? Maybe by then they'll have mutualization of debt in the EU. They'll be issuing their own bonds.
Yeah.
Will London go along? I don't know. I mean, that's going to be things like that.
Well, to our viewers, I just want to let you know that we posted the link to the Transatlantic Trends Survey. If you have not seen it, please, use that link to look at it. There is a lot more information in there than what Bruce was able to present to us today. But Bruce, I want to thank you for really sharing with us these overarching trends and for having this conversation with us. I could certainly go on, and there are a number of topics that we did not even sort of drill down on, like the issue of China, which I think is also interesting. But I want to thank you for your work on this and for sharing the results with us today.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye-bye.